Although I will talk about my experiences as a sociologist and how that relates to this, because it's kind of hard not to. So, I humbly come to you as just a fan of sci-fi and fantasy to talk about why it's important for everybody else. So the reason for the title, in case you're wondering, if you have been unaware, the genre of sci-fi and fantasy and everything related to it, the books, the movies, the video games, the stereotype is that it's white boys, white men. And to be fair, most of the people who I was friends with growing up who were into the same stuff as me, sci-fi and fantasy, they were mostly white boys. I ended up marrying one of them, so it is to an extent true. But what I want to talk about is why this genre is important for women of color, for people of color, for just women, and for everybody else, right? Not just the people who represent the stereotype who follows the genre. Okay, so.
Here you go.
Okay. So I grew up with science fiction and fantasy. I'm not a hardcore fan. I couldn't sit around for hours dissecting specific worlds or regurgitating universe Bibles to you. And most of what I've read is what you would probably call surface, right? Most of those titles are recognizable. So I'm not going to get into a contest with anybody about the breadth of my sci-fi and fantasy knowledge or the obscurity of the things that I like. I'll lose that battle. You cannot invite me to trivia night for sci-fi and fantasy. We will lose, unless you're good. But it was always the genre that I gravitated towards. Growing up, grew up in Fort Worth, and I would go to the downtown Fort Worth library, and I would just beeline straight to that section. In the bookstores, and we finally got a Barnes & Noble in our area, that is exactly where I go, straight to sci-fi fantasy. Used bookstores were the best, because then you get like the really old copies of sci-fi and fantasy, and just you could spend forever there, and that's where I would be. So I probably can't name many of the books that I lived with in my adolescent years. I've forgotten a lot of them. I just know that they did something to me. I like the Forgotten Realms series. I read those a lot in high school. I like Game of Thrones. I met George R.R. Martin. He's pretty cool. I didn't harass him about the book that he hasn't written yet. Just shook his hand and he signed my book, and that was it. The Ender and Bean series, loved those, mostly in high school. Just about anything by Ursula Le Guin. She is my, I was extremely sad when she passed away, because she is, just this last year, because she's a game changer. She's a game changer. Kurt Vonnegut's Sirens of Titan, get that one in there. A little bit of Asimov and Heinlein here and there. It's a little too masculine sometimes for me, but a little bit of that. And right now I'm all about the Expanse series. I'm kind of on the fence with the TV series. I don't know quite how I feel about it yet, but the books for sure. I'm looking forward to the new one. Comes out soon. I think it's not out already. So, a little bit about me. My life was unconventional, even by the standards of somebody who acknowledges that life is rarely conventional. My identity is a patchwork of ethnicities. I'm multiracial, and that has been confusing my whole life. A complication of gender constraints full of incongruencies. Nothing that I thought I was made sense compared to what people said I was supposed to be. Everybody experiences that to some extent, I think. You're all working within the expectations of who people think you are. But it's a particular kind of discord when you're living in a world that tells you you're not in charge, and that's the way it is. This world was not made for you. So, a tension has always existed between me and the world, to kind of steal the tongue and secrets words a little bit. And I wouldn't figure that out, that's always existed. And I wouldn't figure it out until I was an adult studying sociology why that was. Why it was that this tension existed between me and what the world expected me to be. Okay? So I developed this sociological imagination. Has anyone ever taken a sociology class? A few of you have. So you should, Soc 101, that should be one of the first things you learn, right? Is this understanding that we're affected by our social environment, and our social environment is affected by us. It's a feedback loop, right? So we define each other. And what I learned, right, is I learned why it was so difficult to be a brown girl and try to be all the things I wanted to be at the same time. I learned why that was so hard. Because I wasn't just me, I was what society said I was too, right? And it's honestly why I fell in love with sociology, with the study of society and social institutions and human social behavior. Things that didn't make sense when I was only looking at myself made more sense when I realized that I was part of a larger structure. And so, a little plug there for sociology if you're still trying to decide what to major in. Before I got to the point where I learned how to articulate what was going on, where I got into higher education, studied sociology, realized that there was more to me than me, that I was also a part of society. I realized I was already in some sort of unconscious way already looking for those answers. I didn't know that's what I was doing, but from a very young age, it was in the books. It was in these books. It's why I always went there. I was in Speaker for the Dead, which I like more than Ender's Game. Ender's Shadow, the Twin Towers from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Wizard of Earthsea, the Dark Elf trilogy. It was in those worlds where misfits go on these journeys, or they go off to atone for something they've done, because they're trying to make sense of who they are now that they've gone through this experience. They're trying to make sense of who they are and where they've been, right? So Ender and Ged both on long voyages of atonement for single regrets, right? Looking for life in their own humanity, beings showing up out of nowhere, out of the streets, right? And to everybody's underestimation, this little kid just coming out of nowhere. Legolas pausing in the middle of the war to save the world because the trees are talking. Driss rejecting all expectations and constraints. Going against a power hierarchy that's vicious and violent and ruthless, and choosing to live in sunlight, which, if you're unfamiliar with the Dark Elf trilogy, Driss is a dark elf. He can't live in sunlight, but he goes out there because he can't tolerate the world that he's in. I thought for the longest time that I was escaping into those worlds. I thought I was getting away, escaping to these lives that seemed so different and fantastical from my own. But somebody eventually taught me that I wasn't going anywhere at all. And it was this woman right here. When I was in my early 20s, The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin, this is my copy right here, finally made it into my hands. Finally. I don't know why it took me until I was a graduate student in sociology to read this book. I don't know why it took me that long. I was well into studying sociology at this point, and my then fiance, he kept telling me, you've got to read this book, you've got to read this book. He said I needed to read this book because it was a great sociological experiment. And so I finally listened to him, and I crushed it. I just crushed it out in like a matter of days. Up to this point, I had not drawn much of a connection between my love for books like this and my passion for sociology. I hadn't realized that I was doing the same thing, no matter what area of interest I was in. But then I opened up this book, and for some reason, I normally don't do this, but for some reason, I decided to read the introduction to this book, to the edition of this book. Normally, I don't really want to read authors going on about themselves. I know that's rude, but I don't.
Yes, we think it is rude.
But for some reason, I wanted to read the introduction to this one. I'd already read some of Ursula Le Guin's other work. I read Wizard of Earthsea already. So I read it, and what I learned was that science fiction wasn't actually taking me anywhere at all. She said science fiction in the introduction, she says it's not predictive, it's descriptive. And then she says in general, all fiction is a metaphor. She says in reading a novel, any novel, we have to know perfectly well that the whole thing is nonsense. And then while reading, believe every word of it. She says finally, when we're done with it, we may find that we're a bit different from what we were before we read it. It's very hard to say just what we learned, how we were changed. Okay? So with this introduction, Ursula Le Guin turned my brain upside down. And then she would do that 100 more times in this book, because it's just incredible. So I read that and I said, now hold on, Ursula. Are you telling me that I never left? Are you telling me that I didn't go anywhere? Are you telling me that all of those worlds that I've been jumping into were just telling me something about my own world? And it was a whole new way. Sorry, let me go back. It was a whole new way of thinking about it, right? You're now leaving our world, or are you? You're actually not. So I realized, just as she said, that in little ways, without being able to put my finger on what I had learned, I was actually learning about my own world. I was learning about everything around me. I was learning about who I was, where I was, and what was going on around me. Because science fiction and fantasy are not predicting a world that is to come, even though it seems that way, right? They go into these futuristic scenarios sometimes. They're not taking you far away. They're just putting a different lens on where we already are, who we already are. So I entered that novel and stepped into Ursula's Planet of Androgyny, a little bit of a spoiler of what it's about, where gender does not exist. And I went in now understanding that I had not entered the realm of possibility, or some kind of prediction, or some kind of counterfactual. Because that's what you might think if you don't realize what sci-fi is doing. You might think Ursula Le Guin's world where gender doesn't exist, it's some sort of counterfactual to the world we live in. But it's actually not. It's not at all. I was learning about myself right now, about us, about what we are when we're stripped of the layers of socialization and norms that have been painted on us and injected into us for all of our lives. That's what I was learning in that book. We are, underneath all those layers of socialization, we are genderless. We're androgynous. We're capable of being both mother and father, friend and lover, right? All these characters who switch from one thing to another throughout the book. Underneath those layers of constructed identity, we are still such complex, beautiful beings, which is the most amazing thing. To go through this book, constantly trying to impose gender on the characters and realizing you can't, you literally can't, she won't let you, and realizing that these people are still so complex. In fact, they're more complex without all those layers of social identity put on them. When nobody is making us be any one thing, we're the most complex we could possibly be. And I realized she was describing us. That was us she was talking about. Okay, so what does that mean for a brown girl? What does that mean for me? What does that mean for people who aren't white males, which if you go back to the greats, the legends, they're mainly writing for white men a lot of the time. What does it mean for somebody who grew up being told in so many ways that this world was not made for me? That the body I was born with meant that I could only be these things that are attached to the identities that are imposed on me. It meant that what I was actually looking for in the science fiction and fantasy sections of the libraries and bookstores where I was so happy was different ways for people to tell me that it was all, there's kids in the room, BS. Different ways for people to tell me that it was all BS. This idea that you are what people will tell you you are based on these social identities that are imposed on you. It meant that what I was finding was not only that, but also a critical understanding of why we swallow that BS, those lies. Because what science fiction does, what fantasy does, so cleverly and so subtly, you don't even realize it's happening sometimes, is it lets you pick the world apart. It lets you pick human behavior apart in a way that for some reason we can't do with the real things and people around us, or we're resistant to do, is a better way to say it. We're afraid to pick the real world apart, to deconstruct our own reality, because we don't know where we'll stand when we're done. We don't know what's going to happen to us once we undo everything that has defined what we are in society. But we get fooled into thinking that the worlds in science fiction and fantasy are not real. And so we let our guard down. We let those books tear down our world because we don't think we're in our world. We think we're somewhere else. And we learn a little bit of something new. And the real world around us looks slightly different when we come back out. It looks different. You may not realize quite how it's different, but it is. So for a brown girl, I grew up doing something radical. Reading science fiction and fantasy, and in little ways that I couldn't put my finger on, like Ursula Le Guin says, learning how to pick my own world apart and tear down the layers of white supremacy, of patriarchy, of heteronormativity, of religious dominance. I grew up with a very fundamentalist family. Underneath those layers, I realized I didn't feel so strange and incongruent after all. Once I realized that the strangeness, the tension, it was because this world had been constructed around me. And sci-fi and fantasy taught me how to deconstruct it. Once I realized that I could do that, I didn't feel strange. I actually realized it's the world that is strange. It's our world with all of its social constructions that we accept as reality. That's the weird part. We're not weird. The world is weird. So again, as a kid, I didn't realize that's what I was doing. I was not conscious that this is what I was doing. It took me, that plus becoming a sociologist where we deconstruct social realities all the time to realize that that's what I'd been doing my whole life. So as a kid, even as I found myself saying less and watching more and wondering more, I didn't realize that's what I was doing. As a teenager, I didn't realize that's what I was doing, even as I was conforming less and rebelling more. As an adult, I didn't realize that's what I was doing, even as I was accepting less and fighting more. I didn't realize. I hadn't quite put it together that I'd been taught to do this by this genre. So, but like Ursula said, with each story, with each world, with each character's journey, I came away just a little different each time I went into those worlds, because I was going into my own world and learning how to take it apart. So how do I summarize that? I summarize it like this. Science fiction and fantasy, the nerd genre and nerd culture, I proudly call myself a nerd, so that's not a slight, has long been associated with white boys and white men. Like I said, most of my friends were white boys. When I go to my friends who I could talk to sci-fi and fantasy about, that's who they were. Most of the sci-fi and fantasy greats, right, there's the trio, are white men. So you've got, Asimov, Heinlein, Clarke, right? I don't know exactly why that is. I could speculate. I could speculate on why it's been so dominated by white men. But what we don't realize or may not realize is that this genre is also a powerful tool for the marginalized. Because in its own subversive way, it's showing us our own world through a different lens and letting us imagine our own possibilities, our own counterfactuals. It's not taking you somewhere else to a different world so you can escape. It's telling you what your own world looks like if you look at it through someone else's eyes, if you look at it with a different lens. So, I've waxed on how important this genre is for understanding the intersections of identity and marginalization, for deconstructing our social realities. I teach sociology, and I often tell my students that if you love sociology, you should read sci-fi and fantasy, because it's a fun way to be sociological. It's a fun way to deconstruct social realities. So, what work is there left to do? Because I love this genre. I do. It's my favorite. I consume it. It's a little harder now that I teach and have a toddler, but I still will pull up my ebooks on my phone in the middle of the night and read, because I just can't get away from it. The title of my talk alludes to a problem that needs to be addressed still. Even as I've talked about how important it was for me, what this genre has done, there's absolutely some work left to do. Absolutely. So, there's still this pervasive white maleness in the genre, and that's something that we can't deny, and it is a problem that the genre does not still represent everybody who loves it. Right? As much as I appreciate being able to step into my own world, but under a different lens through sci-fi, I still don't often see characters who are like me. I don't read writers who are like me. And that's a problem. So, with all due respect to Asimov and Heinlein and Clarke and Tolkien and the newer guys too, right? We need more women. We need more women of color in this genre. We need them reading it. We need them writing it. There needs to be more. Ursula Le Guin and Octavia Butler should not be exceptions to the rule. They shouldn't be, oh, well, we have one. We have two. There should be more. And I'll mention one more, because they started a movement, right? I said Ursula Le Guin was a game changer, and she was. Octavia Butler, truly incredible. African-American woman who takes us into worlds. It's not just that she is different from the typical white male writer in sci-fi and fantasy. Her characters, she relies on characters. Her dominant characters are queer. She describes them as having dark skin. She describes them as having tight curly hair. She makes an open effort to let you know, this is not your typical white guy. This is somebody different. And they belong here too. And she's doing amazingly well. She's won a Hugo Award 3 times in a row for every book in her Broken Earth trilogy, and it's well-deserved, because those books are absolutely incredible. So we have writers like this who are continuing to change that this problem that we have. But there aren't enough N.K. Jemisons in the genre. There need to be more. Sci-fi and fantasy, to give it some due credit, it has long been ahead of the game in including characters who aren't white, who aren't male. But a deeper analysis would show us that the dominant characters are still white and male, largely straight. Maybe it's because we never really leave our world. So I don't know, maybe that's what Ursula would say, it's because we never leave our world. And in our own world, the dominant group is white and male, but I think that's a poor excuse. I actually don't think that's an excuse at all, because our world is so much more than that. And it's long past time to explore it through different eyes and through different lenses. They're there, so why not put them in the genre where you can amplify those perspectives. So we have the model, we just need to use it. We need to capitalize on it, right? In the real world, we resist this. We stick to our comfort zone. We avoid anything that challenges our own positionality. But because we think sci-fi isn't real, that fantasy isn't real, that it's all so much nonsense, as Ursula Le Guin said, we're willing to let ourselves go somewhere else. We're willing to be someone else and look at the world from another position. So because we let our guard down when we enter the genre, we can do this here without really challenging, and at least not in any open, threatening way, challenging people's sense of positionality. Because they go into that world expecting to be taken somewhere else. So take them somewhere else. And what they won't realize is that when they come back out of it, they'll be a little different than they were before. So why not go ahead and tell the reader that your main character has skin the color of coffee, or that their hair is tightly curled. Why not say the main character is a woman? N.K. Jemisin does it in every book, and guess what? She's doing amazing. People love her books. We love it, and in a little way, we learn something new. We come back to our real world without knowing exactly how we've changed, but we have. Because centering the experiences of people of color, letting the hero of the story be somebody who isn't white or male or heterosexual is less strange than it was before we went into that world. So social constructions are eventually what become the real nonsense. That's what becomes the nonsense. We come back into our real world and we say, why do we only pay attention to this particular group, this particular identity? Why do we prioritize their perspectives over everybody else's? I just came from another world where another group is dominant. So why don't we do that here? And you realize you never left your world. You just realize that there's other voices and other lenses to look at it through. So I think other genres pull this off too, particularly the comic book genre. So I'm less equipped to talk about that. My husband's the comic book guy, not me. Other than to say that just like a sci-fi and fantasy, I think the comic book genre also takes us somewhere else while never going anywhere at all. I think it also does that really well. The comic book universes are usually just our own worlds with a different lens over the camera. At least that's my take on it, from what I've seen. So when you dive into this genre, realize that you're not escaping from anything. Don't try to escape, unless it makes you feel a little more comfortable to think you are, but just know that you're not. You're not going anywhere. Let yourself believe, if you want, that you're getting out of our world, that you're running away. But in reality, you're just opening yourself up to a different way of looking at the world we live in right now. And there's things we can do to progress, continue to progress. This field is so open for it. It's all there. We just have to do these things that I say N.K. Jemisin does so well. She does this so well. And on top of that, just one final thought. I went very quickly through my time, but that's okay. Read women of color. They have stuff to teach us. So make efforts to read women of color. Read the greats too. You know, the greats, the classics, which are mostly white men, and also Ursula Le Guin, who is also a great, the greatest, right? But that's good. But make an effort. They're out there. They're writing. They're publishing. You just have to find them, and they'll tell you something about our world too, and they'll do it really well because they know stuff, and they can teach us stuff that these other people can't. So thank you, and I will take questions and comments. Yeah.
Just a couple more names of women of color who are really impressive writers. Nettie and Nettie Hopkins.
All right.
They're well worth reading. They haven't been published in quite as long as Jemisin, but they're well worth reading.
Yeah, I think they're both on my list. Yeah. Hopkins I know for sure. Yeah. Any comments?
So I teach The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin.
And so does he.
Yeah, and like I was gonna ask, I don't know if you've read that one, but like
it's been a very long time.
And one of the things I love about her is the way in which she's describing societies without trying to idealize, even if she has favorites.
Yes.
And I was wondering if that, from a sociological perspective, is something you're interested in, where these writers, they're not only trying to describe utopias, they're also describing flawed societies that they also think are preferable societies.
Yeah. I think that has a lot to do with what she says, what she believes sci-fi and fantasy does in the first place, which is we never leave our world. And so just like she was highly critical of our own world and had a lot of faith in humans, but also saw so many problems with how we run things. She did the same thing in these worlds that she created. So yes, from a sociological standpoint, I think she does that really well, and I think that was exactly her intention. Right? It was her way of talking about this world, but taking us somewhere else to do it.
Dispossessed would work very well with your thesis because there's a world very much like ours called Earth, and there's a world that sort of has an interesting but not perfect anarchist society. That's an Earth, and they're fascinating because one of the things I love about Le Guin is she never lets anybody off the hook. Even though she clearly prefers this anarchist society at some level, she realizes the problems inherent in anarchism as it evolves. Yeah. And it's fascinating. I highly recommend, if you're not familiar with it, it's worth your time. And it fits your thesis perfectly because one world is very much ours.
Yeah.
We call it something different, but it's us.
Yeah.
One quick question. As an old straight white guy, it is interesting. You talk about the great, Bradbury, Asimov, Clark, Heinlein, and it's interesting. Why would they have found, if the world mirrors them so much more, why would they have found the need, the desire, the thrill of going someplace that wasn't like the world that says, hey, you're a white guy, you're going to be head honcho? Why would they be interested in that? Whereas science fiction is just always aliens for the alienated, not we all alienated sometimes.
I think to some extent we all, feel, like I said in the beginning, I think to some extent we all feel the constraints of identities that are imposed on us, right? So I think even for the straight white guys, that's true. Although they have a little bit of advantage in the world that they're already in. But I think even they want to find, they want to deconstruct the reality that they live in.
Well, the phrase you use, which I think is a really great one, is the world was not made for me.
Yeah.
And I think all of us experience that to some degree.
I think we all do to some degree. I do. Yeah.
It's a great phrase.